Oh boy. We're in for a wild ride on this one. Welcome to 2023. I have declared war on the word content and everything that comes with it. We make videos here and sometimes bad jokes. Get ready for some spookies and some im-sims later on. Today, we're gonna get into a game I just didn't have time for when it came out called Signalis. You might have heard of it because it's an absolute banger of a game that everyone and their cousin did a 45-minute video on trying to wrap their head around the story. Never mind that for now though. Signalis just set the bar for what a spooky game should be. Not a spooky indie game, but all spooky games. Signalis technically isn't an indie as it was published by Humble, but I think the definition of what an indie dev is has changed over the years to mean more like a small team that isn't connected to any major publishers, but that's just semantics. Signalis is indeed, if you can believe it or not, essentially made by like two people over at Rose Engine, but I personally wouldn't have guessed that up until the credits where I saw the same two names on almost everything. It's a survival horror game presented from a mostly top-down perspective that goes from spooky to weird to outright surreal over the course of Elster's attempt to find the pilot of her ship, the girl in this picture. Things are a little weird in that outpost though. Yeah, I think something's going on here. Say hello to Elster, our protagonist, who people have been drawing with Marie from Parapedia lately. She wakes up on a spaceship that's clearly not going anywhere ever again. The first thing to note about Elster is that she is a replica, an artificial human purpose-built to carry out certain tasks. Our Elster, Elster-512, is a ship technician replica that has a special power of mashing things together to make new things. This is very important because you only have 6 inventory spaces, which includes weapons and held items. Why? Fascism. The Yusan nation has what they call the Rule of 6, where no one is allowed to have more than 6 personal belongings on them because owning lots of things is for special people. And also none of the replicas have feet. I don't know if that was intentional or not. There's a whole lot of stuff like this that very much adds color to the world around you, and Signalis has some amazing world building for such a small slice of the world we're seeing, but I don't want to get lost in that right now. We'll get into that later. Let's just go over the relevant parts now. Elster and her pilot were aboard a Penrose-class exploratory vessel looking for new worlds for the Yusan to colonize and or mine for resources. Something went very wrong, and now Elster needs to get out of the ship and she needs to find her captain, one A. Yang, according to the ship's documentation. The captain is what's called a gestalt, this world's word for a natural-born human, because now we need to make that differentiation. Captain Yang is nowhere to be found in the ship, so you transition to a first-person segment as you wander into the snow and cross a strange threshold, where you find a copy of The King in Yellow sitting on a desk, calling out for you to pick it up. The next thing you know, you're in a place called Serpensky Outpost, a mining facility, and you have no idea how you got there. Welcome to the mining operation. You start with all sorts of fun and exciting things in the vocational school over on the top, in order to get down deeper into the facility and... But no, it's not one of those games. This is just an homage. Signalis is very much a game of being trapped in a labyrinthine complex with a lot of stuff that doesn't want you alive, and you're desperately trying to find your way out, or in Elster's case, deeper in. You start with only your wits and whatever notes you can find around the facility, but you'll get some guns soon enough, don't you worry. They don't help very much though. Signalis is survival horror through and through. And what is more survival horror than puzzles? The puzzles are awesome. I'm not going to show too much of them because half the fun of the puzzles in Signalis is figuring out how they work. There's a sort of puzzle within the puzzle where first you must find the rules, then you must solve for the rules. Every single one is engaging, and you're never going to be doing the same thing twice. At least not exactly the same thing. Puzzles are also one of the many uses for the radio equipment you find early on, and there's other tools you'll need to find beyond puzzle MacGuffins, such as a flashlight because it's dark in certain areas, or even a seeing eye camera that lets you take pictures to help remember puzzle arrangements, which I personally ended up not really using since, well, I recorded everything. Heck, you could actually brute force most of these puzzles if you really wanted to, but even if that's a viable option, it's almost always not nearly as fast as just using your thinking brain to figure out the puzzle, and it just doesn't really feel like winning when you do that. The puzzles also make great use of Signalis' first-person camera moments, and it's like suddenly we've shifted from a survival horror to an adventure game, even if just for a moment. Yeah, obviously lots of other games have done this before, but Signalis' presentation makes it that much better. Oh yeah, and when you're not doing puzzles, there's freaky zombie-like things. Choose your weapons wisely and make your shots count. The Zamboonies are here. Ammo for weapons that isn't presently loaded into your gun counts as one of your 6 items, so it's not a good idea to have every gun you find on your person. If you got the right amount of nerves, you can wait for your shots to be as accurate as possible before pulling the trigger to bring baddies down with less bullets, and then, if you're quick, you can give them a little stompity stomp before they get back up. However, be careful as to where you shoot enemies down. The one singular problem I found in this game is if you bring down an enemy too close to a door, Elster will just keep on running back and forth and through the door instead of actually finishing an enemy. But saving grace, if an enemy gets back up after being downed, the second time it's downed, it just dies. Ammo is scarce in Sierpinski, and the only thing you'll find less of is a means to heal yourself. Expect to make the trek back to the save room to swap out weapons as you find more ammo for one type of weapon, and then you start running short on what you've got equipped, which is where you'll find the next spooky thing about Signalis. Not only are all these Zambooners creepy as hell, but they get back up after a while. That's right, we are playing by OG Resident Evil rules. And just like Resident Evil, there is a way to permanently kill enemies, but the thermite flares you need to do that are the single rarest items in the game. Like, I think I can count on my hands how many of them I found in an entire playthrough on the default difficulty. Flares are to be used very sparingly, and sometimes you're just gonna have to accept that having a high traffic hallway that you need to go back and forth through a lot with only one enemy that gets back up in it is much better than having a high traffic hallway with 3 enemies that keep getting up in it. Beyond that, it's time to bust out those old juking skills. Now that we know how to deal with the enemies and what we're up against puzzle-wise, let's take a sec to appreciate the enemies of Signalis. Even the lowliest of grunts are presented in an oh shit, what is that manner, and it's clear that whatever's got them is something Elster needs to stay away from. They're all inexplicably fleshy, despite them being replicas and technically artificial. And Jesus, that's a big one! All the enemies in the game are based on the various model replicas which are corrupted by whatever is happening in Sierpinski. The basic enemies are the Yules, small, general-purpose workers meant for unimportant tasks, which travel in packs, love to sing, and are based on the template of a ballerina. I have no idea who in the Yusan Nation thought it was a good idea to make the general workforce theater kids, but I think this infestation is the least of their problems. Then we've got the security models, like the Storches and the Stars, which are 7'2" at their shortest and uncomfortably tanky. There's also the ones I refer to as these fuckers, who literally jump out at you from under the floor and they get you real fast. And last but not least, for things that you will encounter in Sierpinski Station, epilepsy warning by the way, so if flashing lights and images are an issue for you, you might want to tab away for a sec. They are the Kolbri, and they are psychics that have gone berserk and will assault your mind with flashing images of eldritch prophecies while you desperately try to tune your radio to find the counter frequency to block them out. By the way, the other corrupted replicas will be attacking while this is happening, and epilepsy warning is over. You can tab back in now. And these are just the basic enemies. As we get into Sierpinski Station, we meet a Gestalt named Isa, who seems nice enough. She's also looking for someone, and she's got this cool knife that helps her out. We also get some help from another replica named Adler, who I think is the only male replica on the station. He helps us by pushing us down an elevator shaft so we can get closer to the mine. Based on all the other Elster models down here at the bottom of the shaft, he seems pretty good at helping people. I also want to take the time here to say that Signalis does amazing work with switching back and forth between the game cinematics, pixel art, and cutscenes when the big story beats happen. You'll love to see that sort of blending of all three. And speaking of the 3D first person, Elster's been having some weird dreams, or perhaps hallucinations, or strange places and odd memories. Are these hers? How would she have some of these memories if she was a purpose-built replica? We'll have to go deeper to find out. Time to jump into the sketchy hole at the bottom of the mines. Before we go any further, This next segment will have mild spoilers, aka we're going to the next area where a lot of plot stuff develops and a lot of things start being revealed. Like, not in a endgame spoilers kind of sense, but in a, oh, like this would ruin the surprise of how weird things get if you were to watch it. It's not going to be ruining the whole plot for you, and I'm not going to go into that just yet, but I understand if you don't want the surprise of how weird things get ruined for you, so no judgment if you want to skip to the timestamp for the wrap up now. Welcome to nowhere. Just like the mines that you were briefly in towards the end of the first leg of this game, there is no map. Well, that's not too bad, you say to yourself as you were able to manage during your brief period in the mines. Wrong. Nowhere doesn't follow rules. Rooms that seem like they should be right next to each other are on other sides of the map. You'll leave a room going one direction and enter the next room in a way that should be impossible. Oh yeah, and that's probably not strawberry jello that's pulsating on the floor and the walls. What even is this place? You don't know how you got here, but before you got back to the gameplay, you have a strange dream where you're on a surreal coastline. There was a book inside of a little cave there, but you couldn't quite reach it. You followed a trail of cryptic notes that brought you further up the shore, but then the next thing you know, before you could reach the strange formation at the other side of the beach, you're in a place that has no tangible connection to the colony. There's a strange offering altar and what look to be cages for something human-sized. Odd displays everywhere that have no real purpose, at least that can be seen. And those are just the relatively normal rooms. What are we even supposed to be doing here? So something you're gonna notice right off the bat is that the enemies in the game are getting worse with their corruption, and oh god, what is that? That is not supposed to exist. Kill it! Kill it now! Yeah, they're getting way freakier now. Down here in nowhere, the more advanced replica models are being affected by whatever this thing is, and the results are pretty wild. The mutations are now going beyond just looking kind of zombie-ish, and they're making the replicas grow extra limbs on their face or become whatever the hell that cage thing was. Thank goodness that Issa was here with the big gun to kill that thing, because everything in nowhere is much deadlier now. Basic enemies are more messed up and are much tankier and much faster now, and they hit like a truck. Lucky for you, there are a few more ways to deal with these things now, like the flare gun you hopefully found in the mines, which not only one-shots enemies, provided you hit them of course since these things can miss very easily, but also burns them in a way that perma-kills them. Later on you can put grenades into this sucker too to make Elbonia's finest compact heavy ordnance system, but it does surprising little damage even though it's an AoE attack, and I think it also perma-kills, but I was never quite certain. Speaking of flares, it's oddly fitting that the freakier the enemies get, the less of them you are going to find. Elster can carefully walk around enemies, making sure to be quiet and staying out of line of sight, and also maybe turn your flashlight off. But now more than ever, your juking abilities are going to be tested, especially in the fleshy barbed wire hell maze. If the enemy is getting weird for you wasn't enough, the puzzles have gotten weirder too. Back in Serpensky, all the puzzles, while challenging and requiring a bit of cerebral horsepower, were things that were rooted in reality, like balancing out the power flow to get an elevator working or cracking a locked door with professional tools. Here, things get much more symbolic. In Nowhere, you'll be doing things like finding incense to make an offering at the altar, finding all the rings for a statue of the Queen's hand, or leaving an equal exchange at another altar deeper within Nowhere. Your radio comes into play much more as whatever this place is, it responds to radio frequencies. Most of these puzzles reward you with either an item you'll need for another puzzle or a hexagonal plate. We found one or two of those plates earlier back in Serpensky, but they didn't really do anything until now. Once you get deep enough into Nowhere, you'll find a room that has a wall that can accept 6 plates shaped just like the ones we found earlier. The closer we get to this room in Nowhere, the more mutated replicas are messed up and the nastier they are towards you, but they're oddly absent from the room itself. There's even one of those heavy industry units, a Mina, that we fought as a boss battle, just hanging out with a bunch of other nasty replicas I wouldn't want to deal with on their own in one of the rooms. That room happens to have a thing you absolutely need to progress in it, so good luck. So eventually we get Issa to come to after the encounter with that thing that looked more like it was at home in Silent Hill than Resident Evil, and she gives us the Ultra Glock. It only holds 2 shots, but very little is going to survive more than 1. Ammo's pretty rare though, but that's not so bad now that we have a bunch of other weapons to cycle through. The puzzles are challenging and the enemies are more frequent, but we're getting through them. No idea where Issa went after she woke up though. After collecting all the tablets, the wall opens up to reveal a room that we've been in before. at the beginning of the game. It's the same place where we initially crawled through that hole to find the King in Yellow. This is what I was warning you all about earlier in this section of the game. Things are going to get outright surreal. As we enter the hole this time, we find ourselves at the threshold, except now instead of being all snowy, it's standing atop a hill in a sea of what I'm guessing might be blood or may as well be blood. Adler is there too, and he's not making much sense, saying things like how he's been here many times now and that Falk, the replica administrator model of Sierpinski, went beyond the threshold, and when she came back, she wouldn't tell anyone about what she saw, but shortly after returning, she got sick, fell into a coma, and all this stuff started happening. Elster doesn't really care about Adler's ramblings, so she just crosses the threshold. She's got to find Captain Yang. Welcome back to the video. Things are about to get surreal in the world of Signalis, and if you want to experience it for yourself, I'd suggest skipping to the timestamp now and coming back later. I know I already said this earlier, but with a game like Signalis, it's hard to get into it without revealing more of the story, especially the big gotcha moments. Each new area is a revelation that adds more questions than it answers, and it wouldn't make any sense without telling these parts. You still with me? Cool. So the end is not the end. After you go through the room that was similar to the one you first entered at the beginning of the game and talk to Adler, Elster crosses the threshold and wanders to see if what we will assume is some kind of blood. There's all sorts of strange structures around here, and a lot of dead hers. But only one thing grabs Elster's interest. The Penrose 512 is now crashed in the Red Sea, just like it was at the beginning of the game. But now, Elster is stuck outside of it. Elster climbs up to the ship's emergency access port and tries to force it open in hopes of seeing Captain Yang. She really does try. She tries to wrench the door open so hard that she goes full Ghost in the Shell and rips off her arm from overexertion. After she helplessly tumbles down the side of the ship, we get one last look at Elster's lifeless eyes and are given a message. Wake up. Roll the credits. This actually got me. I genuinely thought I had gotten a bad ending because I spent too much time faffing about in Sierpinski and that as punishment I didn't get to see the full ending. But no. This was a high-caliber bamboozle. You'll notice that after you're kicked back to the title menu, that Elster's eyes that used to follow your cursor as you selected menu items don't move anymore. They're just lifeless, like our own playthrough's Elster. If you quit out and restart the game, you'll go back to normal, and you're given the option to continue the game, which will drop you off at the last save before you cross the threshold. When you choose to start a new game at the Dead Elster screen, everything will start like it normally does. Except this time, the Penrose 512 is operational. And now instead of finding a way to get off the ship, you're doing a pre-flight checklist. Once you're done, you go into the canteen, and there's Captain Yang, who you're on first name terms with. Surprise to almost no one at this point, but it turns out that Elster and Captain Ariane are roommates. We go back to the beach before finding ourselves at the Sierpinski Vocational School once again. You don't spend a lot of time here as things have gotten much, much worse since you were last here. And now there are much nastier things from deep down in nowhere hanging around in the halls. There's not much else to note here outside of the chalkboard in the classroom says, "You've been here before," as we jump into yet another flesh hole where the northern classroom used to be. Next thing we know, we're at Rotfront Station, a colony of the Yusan Nation. I'd ask how we got here, but at this point it seems futile. Rotfront is a fitting final area. You get your map back, but it's chock full of the toughest enemies in the game, and not only are the puzzles challenging, but some of them require legwork that has you repeatedly crossing very dangerous areas. Speaking of those puzzles, while Sierpinski was rooted in logic and nowhere was in the fantastical, Rotfront seems to be blurring the lines. Sometimes you'll be finding things necessary to develop a photo to find an important clue, or installing software onto a computer to coordinate the satellite array. Other times, you'll be using the interpretation of a dream diary to organize tarot cards in someone's old abandoned bedroom. There's this thing that's nagging at me though. Never mind the whole distance thing, like we are literally on a different planet now, but there's no way that we could really be here. This is most likely some kind of corrupted memory brought on by the entity that's doing all this fleshy stuff, but this is a memory that we personally couldn't possibly have. Without getting too much into it right at this moment, replicas are purpose-built for their roles, and have a relatively short lifespan compared to just alt humans. Elster 512 might not have existed when these memories were being made. There's been references here and there to some sort of entity found deep below the surface that assimilates all the life it comes into contact with into it, but we're artificial life, so how exactly does that work? I don't think we should think about it too hard right this instant though. I promise I will try and sort this out in the major spoilers section, but for now, we've got a hell of a boss fight to deal with. After juking a lot of corrupted replicas, we have to crawl through that hole in that room one more time. And hey, this is that same room at the beginning of the game, the one where we got the King in Yellow. We find some letters that we'll get into later on, and then we're back into the room in Sierpinski Station where the commander unit, the Falk, was in some sort of coma, but now she's getting up. Like floating in the air getting up. Oh boy. Falk is every nasty thing that we've dealt with up until this point, rolled into one 8-foot-tall psychic lady. Control yourselves, please. She's currently hurling spears at us with telekinesis. You're going to need to prepare very well before getting into this because Falk is a goddamn tank, and you're going to need to dole out a lot of pain in order to make her vulnerable enough to do damage, and then hope you're fast enough to grab one of her spears, since that's the only thing that can actually hurt her. All the time while this is going on, you're getting psychically attacked like what the Colbrys do to you, and also Falk is teleporting you around into different areas with different obstacles. At least there's pistol ammo in some of them. These psychic attacks have some weird messages in them, and if you look very closely, Falk briefly reverts to her non-corrupted form before attacking. When Falk goes down, things get especially weird. This is your final warning. If you want to see how this all goes down and suss it out for yourself before hearing my take on it, click to the timestamp now. Welcome to the end, I think. Before we fought Falk, she was saying a lot of things that she couldn't have been involved with, like how she doesn't want anything to do with either of them anymore, she presumably being Ariane. When you finally defeat her, she says that you and her are one now, and the next thing you know, we're back at the threshold again, posing like some sort of gate guardian and warning us that this world can't take another cycle. He tries to stop us, but he brought a knife to a gunfight, so that's on him. We cross the threshold as Adler warns us one last time that we'll destroy everything through the power of the title cards in the game. Elster trudges on through the Red Sea one more time, and this time she is strong enough to force open the emergency access door to Penrose 512. What happens next is dependent on variables in your playthrough that are for once not just singular choices you made at certain points in the game, based on things like your playtime. How many corrupted replicas did you kill? How often did you talk to the uncorrupted replicas that are hiding out inside Sierpinski? How often were you close to death? And possibly a few other things. The one common denominator though, is that either by your own hand or by your inaction, Ariane is dead. There is a secret ending, but I'm not hardcore enough to get that, and it sheds a little more light on things and really hammers home that you're in some kind of loop. Okay, so now we're gonna see why no one can make a short video on Signalis. We've got to get into this. We have seen too much not to. On the surface level, there seems to be some sort of entity that's interfering with life wherever Elster is. We don't actually know where she is, and we keep on jumping around to places we couldn't possibly be, so we have reason to believe that what we're seeing is not real. One of the first actions we take in the game is to take a copy of The King in Yellow, a mythical book that contains a play which drives all those who experience it insane. There's also something I haven't mentioned until now, which is bioresonance. Bioresonance is something that isn't explained too much in Signalis, except for the fact that it revolutionized technology, made the creation of replica humans possible, and the ruler of the Yusan nation is supposedly very good at it, and it can be used to control and influence people, like how the Colbrys, the psychic attackers, do to you throughout the game. Replicas are made through using bioresonance to scan a template of someone's mind, which then can be placed into an artificial body for mass production. It's an imperfect process though. Throughout the game we find notes for colony admins that state that the personality quirks of all the replicas, their upkeep procedures, and known defects for most replicas. Some are pretty low maintenance, like the Yules, who only really need music and a mirror in their dormitory. Some are much more extreme, like the Colbrys, who the second they start malfunctioning in the slightest, the only fix is to take them to a farm-up state before their heightened bioresonance abilities cause mass deterioration among other replicas. Whatever they found in Sierpinski, or wherever this actually is causing a whole new batch of errors beyond the normal ones. The few replicas that we meet that aren't suffering from the effects of this corruption have strange issues. Adler's diary reveals that he has no recollection of writing any of the previous entries in it, and that all the entries are dated the same day, which is today. A star unit tells one of the last functional Yules that she can remember her Gestalt name. An intact Colbury seems to be able to feel whatever this corruption is thanks to her bioresonance abilities. We don't know how this is affecting Elster, if at all, but Adler made a point to help every last one he could find on Serpensky down the elevator shaft because, as it turns out, the master template for the Elster units was lost a while ago, and they're being made off a copy from a dead Elster that they found somewhere. There's a chance that our Elster is a copy of an already damaged copy. Maybe that's why things are getting so weird around her. But then we've got Issa, the only Gestalt human we really see during the events of the game. Issa's here looking for her sister, and for whatever reason, Adler especially wants her dead. Come to think of it, Adler seems to have the best understanding of what's going on out of everyone, but he's not keen on explaining much. When Issa finally finds the fate of her sister in the camera shop that she used to work in and growing up, she just loses hope and disintegrates into nothing. Back to that thing I mentioned earlier. There's some sort of entity that's known in the world of Signalis, or at least written about, that dissolves the flesh of all those that come into contact with it and makes it a part of them, merging it into some sort of collective. Issa probably fell victim to this, and there's a chance that some of the memories we lived are hers. But what about all these corrupted replicas? Well, there's a possibility that because they're made of artificial flesh, they don't properly interface with the entity, and whatever causes them to corrupt like they do is a side effect of that. It's stated in a survival menu that Gestalt humans should absolutely not eat their assigned replicas in the event of being stranded because replica blood is actually oxidizer chemicals, and that their flesh, while theoretically edible, would do a lot of damage to someone if they tried to eat it. Whatever this thing is might not be able to properly absorb the replicas, but might be able to interface with them, and whatever causes these mass hallucinations which make us jump planets and such. But that doesn't explain how Adler seemingly can see through the fourth wall of all of this and is trying to prevent further degradation of this loop, which leads us to a theory that I'm probably not the first to bring up. And side note real quick, in case you didn't know, I try not to watch other people's videos before my own is released if I'm planning to do a video on that topic. This might all be inside of Elster's head. When we go through the Penrose 512 for the second time around to do the flight check, there's some rather alarming diary entries written by Ariane, which contradicts how she's feeling when we see her. Then later, when we get to the end for real, we find more notes regarding the end of Ariane and Elster's mission. It would seem that both the ship's resources and the safety systems have reached their limit, and the final message is rather grim. Ariane and Elster are now drifting in space with nowhere habitable in sight. No help is coming from the Yusan nation, and the icing on the cake is that the air filtration system is busted, and now tons of radiation is leaking into the ship. Not to mention that on top of being made from a potentially shoddy template, Elster is near the end of her replica life cycle according to documentation. Elster can't be in good shape right now, especially since she stripped her own dead body for parts when we entered the second loop. This whole loop that Elster has been experiencing might be some sort of near-death state of delirium, or Elster being outright dead, which I also, as I'm checking to verify information on the wiki, turns out is another theory that a lot of people have. The Eldritch thing could just be something that she read about in a book at one point in her life, or in one of the movies that she and Ariane love to watch. The memories from Issa's perspective could be Elster filling in the blanks from things Ariane told her about Issa, since they both lived on Rotfront at about the same time. Adler could be some part of Elster that's still aware that all of this is a lie and that she needs to break the cycle and quote-unquote wake up. All of this could also be entirely off mark for all I know. I saw a tweet from Yuri Stern, one of the developers of Signalis, saying that he gets sad when he sees people refer to an ending as the bad one. Perhaps to him, all the endings have value in them, and perhaps they're all different interpretations of the same thing. Also, unless you want to hint that there was a certain thing you needed to do earlier in the game, why put a quote-unquote bad ending in your game? If I had to put my final be-all end-all theory on this, it would be that, like death, whatever really happened during the events of Signalis is truly unknowable. Not in a, oh, this is just too obtuse type of way, but in a way where if we were just handed all the answers or even had to dig for them, it would ruin the mystery. Maybe somewhere in a design document or in the devs' heads, there's a concrete answer to all of this, but we shouldn't know. Sure, I know many people have a need to categorize everything into neat little boxes and have all the loose ends tied up, but I personally believe that explaining away all the mysteries in a story ruins it. Like for me personally, one of my biggest disappointments in games recently was how they ended up explaining things in Outlast 2, which while fitting for the story, takes the fun out of everything that was happening. It's like if a magician ended their show with a step-by-step demonstration of how every trick was performed. But who knows? Maybe there's a big old solution to all of this that's somewhere in the game that's satisfying satisfying enough for the people who want things explained, but still has a little mystery left for people like me. This is all just a theory, though. No, I am not saying the line. Get out. Signalis is more than just indie horror. It's more than the total number of developers involved in it, or how much money the project cost whoever was funding it, or even the scope of its gameplay. Signalis isn't just excellent indie horror. It's excellent horror, excellent survival horror, which is to be remembered regardless of its pedigree. In a sea of what I now know to be called mascot horror and retro PS1 stylings, Signalis stands on its own, as not something to be judged by its presentation or niche, but as a marvel of gameplay, horror, and storytelling within a video game. Sure, it's got a fair smattering of core elements from classic survival horror, such as limited inventory, oodles of puzzles, and symbolic body horror, but it does them in a way that is entirely its own. Also, before I forget to mention it, despite not really being what I consider mainline PS1 style horror, Signalis does a better job at the PS1 styling than most of the games going for it, because it remembers that 3D graphics were still very limited back then when the PS1 was, actually a thing, so in order to make everything fit, you had to put in a lot of 2D scenes and graphical tricks. The reason why so many PS1 games came on like 2 or even 3 or 4 discs was because each of those discs only had about a little over half a gigabyte of space on them. And you know what? Since I'm making another edit of this video with all those cute little yellow $ symbols to make sure YouTube doesn't algorithm me, I may as well talk about something else that I can't really display all that well. The music in Signalis is wonderful. It is excellent. Unfortunately, it's not really on any streaming services, but Rose Engine has uploaded the whole OST onto their YouTube channel, which I'll link below. It's fitting, and sometimes it's really great at ratcheting up the tension, but other times it just has this dramatic weight that just adds so much beauty to scenes, especially towards the end. And if you want a quick and dirty explanation as to why I don't really display music all that much, the shortest, quickest way to describe it is just because Rose Engine either commissioned or paid for the rights to use these songs in their game does not mean that I have the rights. And while many game companies will either overtly have clauses or ask like, hey, please do not enforce like your copyright on this, while like for people on YouTube, it's the artist's right so long as they still hold the copyright to enforce it. And I and many others have been bitten before by adding music into a game like that's years and years old, and then a few years later I get like a content ID claim on a video because someone finally decided to exercise their right, or say the thing in their contract saying you can't claim rights to this finally expired and they fed it into content ID. Wow, that explanation was longer than the segment. Yeah, I'll keep it in. I think that's all I can get away with talking about Signalis. I honest to goodness could not recommend this one enough. I want to take the time to give a huge thank you to all the patrons who support me over at patreon.com/charlatanwonder. You make these videos possible. If you'd like to help me fight the good fight against the algorithm, or just really like my videos, feel free to head on over to Patreon, where all the pledges get exclusive updates on videos, the 4K cat clips, early access, and entry into game night. All those are just the base benefits, by the way. There's more. If you can't or won't, that's still cool. Also, if you feel I have earned your subscription, please consider following me on Twitter or joining the Discord, which are both linked below, as YouTube's subscription system is unreliable when it comes to getting videos to you. Now, one last thing before we sign off, and it's something that I want to make a habit of saying at the end of every video. If you make videos like me, if you draw, develop indie games, or anything that is your creative passion, remember one thing. You do not make content. Content is a demeaning word made up by slimy corporate goons that takes all your thoughts, your intentions, aspirations, and skill and grinds them up into a tasteless slurry meant to be mindlessly shoved in front of uncaring eyeballs so that the suits can pat each other on the back when the line goes up. You are better than content. What you do is art. It has a soul. It is irrevocably you, and your expression cannot solely be defined by a series of metrics on an analytics page. Fight against content. Fight against corporate interests wanting to bend your vision and use analytics to push you until you break, and then go and pretend that they actually did something when the quarterly report comes in. Fight for your art. That's all for now. Thank you so much for watching, and stay saucy. Saucy boy. Just where do you think you're going? Why do you have these sits? Why are you in my MagFest packing? I cannot take you with me to the MagFest. You are a threat to society. A menace to the public. You are also too chonkily. You will exceed weight limits on this baggage. You're just gonna make sure it's covered with smells. Is I think outside they're plowing snow. Oh no, I've got you agitated, scrambulated, fluffle-pated. A boy of extreme sauce content. Who's not in the mood? Mission accomplished.